Now the first session, which will be about medical devices. And Dr. Stuart Green will be the first to start. Dr. Green will be starting with really a historical view of medical conflicts of interest, because he is, aside from a clinical professor of orthopedic surgery, he is a historian. He's written numerous articles about Benjamin Franklin in the Federalist period. In fact, he just recently published a book about Benjamin Franklin. And I thought he would put this in a good perspective. He is a pioneer in his own right. Dr. Green brought from Kurgan, Russia, 20 years ago, the Ilifzadov leg lengthening device, which has since become used for fractures, non-unions, different medical things. It's become a standard of care, actually. And he was the first to bring it to this country and do it here. And I remember when it was on the cover of Time magazine, actually 20 years ago. And so I would like to introduce Dr. Stuart Green.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And the previous speaker mentioned theological issues briefly, and I just want to tell you, Chuck, this is the first meeting that I've ever been to in my life where bacon, eggs Benedict, and cheese blintzes have been served right next to each other. So I think from that perspective, this talk is going to be, and the meeting is going to be very ecumenical, if nothing else. Which is the one that moves us forward? Got it. Okay. The presentation I'm going to provide is based on a number of papers that I've published in clinical orthopedics over the years, including Orthopedic Surgeons Inheritors of Tradition, The Evolution of Medical Technology, The Origin of Modern Clinical Research, and finally, Surgeons and Shamans, The Placebo Value of Ritual. We're going to be focusing primarily also, by the way, the book on Franklin. We're going to be focusing primarily on the article on the evolution of medical technology, Lessons from the Burgess Shale. The story starts here in Western Canada at the Burgess Shale, a shale quarry that was created 1.5 billion years ago when a mudslide trapped a number of soft-bodied organisms in the water. When these shale pieces were broken apart, the creatures that came out were rather peculiar looking. For example, one that had 5 eyes and a claw at the end of its nose, another that had 7 pairs of appendages, and the scientists couldn't really understand which phyla these belonged to and created their own separate phyla for each of these kinds of creatures, because there's no modern version of them that exists or anything close to these things. And the question was, where did they fit into the so-called cone of diversity that we ordinarily associate with evolution? It turns out there is no cone of diversity. What really happens is this situation: diversity and decimation. There are a number of different forms that exist that become extinct. This occurs in what's called an empty landscape environment. In the Cambrian period, when these creatures first came into being, there were no multicellular creatures, only single-cellular creatures. And what happened is nature tried a number of different experiments, and only those that had the most successful body designs are the ones that led to further developments in life. This is one of the fundamental principles. It's called diversity and decimation. Stephen Jay Gould, in his book Wonderful Life, says that this is a characteristic feature of all empty landscape biological systems. Stuart Kaufman, who's a systems guy, said that it is the feature of all complex systems involving in an empty landscape environment. For example, the automobile, when it first came about, had very peculiar forms, and so did computer operating systems. I mean, recall there was the Radio Shack had their own, Compaq had their own, all these different, and only 2 have survived, really, DOS and Apple system. And I thought, gee, this is really interesting, because total knee replacement came about in the same sort of way. The total hip was invented by John Charnley in the 1960s, and people said, gee, maybe we could do the same thing with a knee. And so there was an empty landscape, and lots of people simultaneously tried to create something new, a medical device that would work for arthritic knees. And some of the early gadgets were rather peculiar looking by our modern standards. This is called the Gunston. This is one of the first ones. 2 runners to substitute for the condyles. They were glued in. The Waldius, a hinge device. These other hinge devices, all with fixed hinges, and of course, within a year or two, these things worked loose, became infected, and there were tremendous problems with these devices. The Herbert, I'll talk to you about that because that's one that one of my partners had some experience with. This goofy-looking thing, 2 polyethylene plugs were put into the femur. That gadget was somehow jammed in there, and this piece went down into the tibia, the long stem, cemented in. These things worked loose within a year or two. Other incredibly bizarre-looking implants. The single most profitable invention from the University of California, Irvine, was the UCI knee. This was actually the first one that actually looked like a knee. Okay? The authors wrote, analysis of the first 25 patients suggests the total knee prosthesis of Irvine, parentheses UCI design, may be inserted without the need of more than average precision and technique. Despite a wide range of patient size, it is not necessary to have more than one prosthesis. One size fits all. Was the Zimmer guy here somewhere? This company is now making, the precision of sizing turns out to be very critical. But anyway, this is what they said. The preoperative range of motion is generally exceeded. The average patient has been dramatically improved, and the knee is almost always converted from a painful to a painless joint. The most profitable patent this university ever had. Now, of course, all the total knees look like a natural knee. There was a kind of convergent evolution. All these other ones fell by the wayside. I made an evolutionary tree, and X's are extinct forms. Okay, 1970, 1980, 1990. You can see all the ones that exist today look like a human knee joint. Okay, here's the UCI knee down over here, one of the grandfathers of the whole process. So the question is, how is it that these things come about, and what happens to them? I mean, where do they go? And what I want to look at first is the reason they come about as a result of marketing pressures. When a designer comes to a company and says, let's make this thing, the company kind of grinds it out, the guy starts to put them in, and now the company wants to see some results. And so does the doctor, by the way, who has a vested interest oftentimes in the implant because his name is associated with it. There's a short follow-up, which is critical in this process, because all these things work for the first year or two. I mean, they're cemented in, and it takes that long for the cement to work loose. And then, of course, what I call developer enthusiasm. The developer is intensely involved in the product. I mean, for lots of different reasons. First of all, everybody wants to be the smartest kid on the block. If the device is successful, then millions of people around the world will say, I've got a Gupta in my knee, or I've got a Gupta in my carpal tunnel. And who doesn't want that? I mean, you're like Jonas Salk, but if this thing actually works out well. You might win the Nobel Prize. And of course, this issue, something we'll be talking and hearing a lot about. Developer enthusiasm, however, causes a certain distortion of the preliminary data. Earliest cases are eliminated for what's called the learning curve. Subjective outcome criteria are often used. In other words, the patient is asked, well, actually the patient isn't asked, how are you doing? The doctor says, oh, you're doing great, aren't you? Short follow-up, as I mentioned earlier, and then bad outcomes are lost to follow-up. And I'm going to go into that with a specific example towards the end of the presentation. There's something else going on that very few people talk about. And that is, I believe that the selection criteria starts with picking the patient for the implant. And I know about this because one of my own partners is developing a total ankle, and he started 10 years ago, and he's only put just a few in. And I see him still doing ankle fusions, and I ask him, why are you doing this? I mean, you've got this product you're working on. He says, oh, well, that guy's a flake, and that one's workers' comp, and that one's this, and that one's that. He is selecting cases that will likely have a good outcome. And I think what happens is there is a subconscious meeting of the mind between the surgeon and the patient. The surgeon somehow conveys to the patient an expectation that you're going to do well, and the patient responds to this. And the surgeon is not going to pick patients where he feels a kind of psychological block, a skepticism, a likely bad outcome, when the surgeon is also the developer and has a vested interest in the outcome. I mean, this is something that I personally perceive of. It's happened in my own experience, because as you'll notice in the thing, I get about $50,000 from Smith & Nephew for a product. And I guarantee you this is what I did when I picked my patients. Loosening and totally replaced what I put it into a search engine and counted the number of articles per 3 years. And look what happened. This is the loosening, and why these things fail. Okay? These guys out over here who are reporting vast 50, 60 articles about loosening of these implants are not the same guys as the developers. They're people without a vested interest. They're different people. They're people who are taking this product when it's on the market already and reporting bad outcomes. And you go back and you ask the developers, the champions back over here, well, how come you didn't report this? Oh, we don't even use that device anymore. We're into Mark II now. We're in Mark III. We're in the 3rd version of it. They just switch for the same reasons that these guys have discovered. These guys discover, after all, with their follow-up, if they're honest with themselves. Charles Eng, a pioneering developer of total hips, was very discouraged with the way in which he pushed the so-called screw-in acetabulum. He said, we can expect all the earliest reports of a new design to be glowing and written by the designers and champions. When a longer-term empiric outcomes are less than rosy, the next wave of reports is written by individuals who are more objective because they are not directly linked to the design, meaning no vested interest in the design itself. He said, because surgeons sell to other surgeons best, companies need surgeon champions who truly believe in the features of their products. That's how he put it. This Herbert prosthesis, again, this is out of France. Actually, I should say Hébert is the correct way to say it. The two that my partner did both ended up in amputation of the leg. And in fact, one of the series reported of 13 that were put in, 8 ended up in amputation, and the others ended up in massive revisions, knee fusions, and so forth. And this is basically what we're talking about here. Failure of a design that seems like a good idea at one point in time when it was first created. So the question is, what was the government's role in regulating the marketing of such devices like the Hébert prosthesis? And the answer is none. Because this product was created in 1974, and the government did not get involved in medical devices until 1976. So how did the U.S. government get involved in regulating medical devices? Hypothesis 1, these are my hypotheses, government regulatory involvement is usually scandal-driven. Hypothesis number 2, government regulation is directly proportional to the magnitude of government regulation is directly proportional to the scandal's volume in the public, in the press. And hypothesis number 3, the scandal's volume is directly proportional to the body count. So what I'm going to be doing is giving you body counts and show you how body counts led to new legislation. The body count is death or serious injury. Okay, scandal number 1, Civil War death from malnutrition and starvation, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln created a body count in the tens of thousands, and this was not a regulatory agency, but a scientific agency, Bureau of Chemistry within the Department of Agriculture. This is the origin of the FDA. It was eventually moved into HEW, but this is where it started out by President Lincoln. And what they wanted to do is to increase the bushels per acre from 8 to 50 for grain, of course. That's the start. Scandal, tainted armor canned meat to U.S. Army during Spanish-American War, 1898 to 1899. The person who wrote the report about it was a young officer named Theodore Roosevelt. Body count in the dozens, but many people were rendered unfit to fight. They used boric acid to cover the smell of the meat in these tin cans, and a lot of soldiers got sick, couldn't fight. It led to a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. He was mostly interested, however, in the workers in these meatpacking factories in Chicago, not so much in the product itself, because the workers were falling into the machines and being chopped up and put out in the sausages and in the tin cans. By this point in time, this young officer was now President of the United States, and Theodore Roosevelt. It led to the Pure Food Act and also the Meat Inspection Act. And industry was actually anxious to have this happen because they were getting a really bad press at the time. Next, Agricultural Appropriations Act established the FDA within the Department of Agriculture. This is not a scandal-driven change. Methanol scandal, 1937, sulfanilamide, the first sulfa drug before penicillin, actually. We had antibiotics. Actually, they're antimicrobials. Dissolved, though, in antifreeze. Body count, 108. 1938, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was the scandal. Thalidomide scandal, 1962, birth defects related to a morning sickness pill. This is what it caused, phocomelia, birth defects. Now, the body count is a little hard to get to, but if you add the spontaneous abortions, the miscarriages, it's about that number. Not in the United States, but in Germany. And that led to the amended Food and Drug Act, proof that a product was both safe and efficacious, 1962. In the 1960s, FDA tried to expand the definition of drugs to include devices, and there was great resistance by industry. However, it turned out the courts were trying to allow the allow the government to stick their nose into devices. This is the one that was really the turning point. I don't know if you remember, but Bacto Unidisc, this is what a disc looks like, an antibiotic disc. They have a culture plate with bacteria on it, and they put these little discs on it to contain antibiotics. And this is how you get your culture and sensitivity. This is the sensitivity part. And the sensitivity is measured by the size of the area where there's no bacteria growing around the disc. What was happening is the companies were putting extra strong antibiotic in these discs, stronger than you could get in the circulation. And so it looked like the antibiotic would be effective based upon the zone of inhibition, but in fact, people were dying. I could not figure out the body count. However, it led the Supreme Court to say the FDA is vital for the protection of public health. The term, quote, drug has a liberal construction consistent with the 1938 Act's overriding purpose to protect public health. So that's how these kind of devices, now this is a device, but it also has antibiotic in it, so it's also a drug. They really weren't sticking their nose in the 1960s into orthopedic implants and things that we're interested here. 1970s, consumer activism, EPA was created, occupational safety, consumer product safety. This was all during this period of what was going on then. Okay, next scandal, Dawkins Shield. We've heard of it, I hope. 1971. Dawkins was a doctor who invented this gadget for to prevent pregnancy, an IUD. Goes into the uterus like so. And there were 4 people in the Dawkins Shield company. Dawkins, his kind of money guy, lawyer, and another doctor. They reported 600 or so cases, no complications, no pregnancies, no nothing. A.H. Robbins' company bought this company out from these guys, and within weeks, one of the scientists there said, hey, wait a second, this is braided, this piece of string here. Maybe germs can be pulled up into the uterus by this braided piece of string. And look at these little things. Maybe they'll damage the uterus, but the company went ahead and marketed the product anyway. Body count, 2.1 million in the lawsuits. Now, you don't know how many of these people were really injured, but you know, this is a class action lawsuit, so you know how those things get. If you ever had one in, you kind of join the class. Medical device amendments, which is why we're all here today. How the government of the United States got involved with medical devices, and that's the reason, Dawkins Shield and other IUDs. 1980 was the orphan drugs. The orphans are diseases for which a very small percentage of the population is involved with, and only it's not worth it for companies to get involved. They didn't want the liability. They didn't want to go through the process. So during the Reagan administration, this is what we had. Certain diseases like Gaucher's, off-label use, and perhaps that has a lot to do with what happened subsequently with some of these orthopedic implants. Lidocaine bolus, for example, for heart disease. This is before the clinical use was accepted. People were noticing these things were working. Treatment for fatal diseases, and of course the AIDS activists got involved in this, and that led to the Orphan Drug Act, which in effect makes each doctor his own FDA or her own FDA. Because you can decide to use an off-label use. And unfortunately what's been happening is some of the sales reps have been presenting off-label use as though it is the accepted use. And this has been one of the problems lately with Vioxx and so forth. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay. 1989, it must come as an unhappy surprise to many to hear that in 1989 we have no assurance that the medical devices used in, on, or around our bodies are safe. Congressman Henry Waxman. What he was talking about there, he said the American device industry cannot be trusted. Press release from his office. And what he was talking about there were broken leads from Medtronic's pacemakers. I don't know if you remember this particular scandal. This was polyethylene, and basically how this came to pass, in spite of the fact that these products were introduced after the 1976 legislation, is something called piggybacking. And I'll tell you how items are piggybacked. It's called piggybacking onto 510Ks, and I'll explain this process in a few minutes. Okay. Body count 17,000 from these broken leads. Now, these are the people who are in the class action. And as I understand it, that represents 85% of the people who claim to have been injured, because some people went on their own and sued the companies. So probably, maybe 20,000 might be the body count. And it led to the Safe Medical Device Act of 1990. Okay? This includes civil penalties for underreporting adverse events during trials only, because that's really, once it's in the market, as we'll see, government's wasn't too interested. We also had the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. You remember that? Companies didn't want to make vaccines anymore because there was rare events that were causing huge liabilities. Pacemaker reimbursement review was related to this particular process. This is not actually it is a liability-driven thing. Okay, 2006, Vioxx Baxter scandal. COX-2 related risks underreported to the FDA when these products were released, when the applications were sent to the feds. Body count 24,000. Again, this represents about 85% of the people who were suing. As you know, a federal judge declassified the class, and so did a New Jersey judge. So these are people are going to have to go individually now after the company. 2007 FDA amendments, increased post-market surveillance. Looks like it's going to be the outcome. We have some people here, I guess, from the federal government, and they'll tell us whether or not this is really going to work. But this is kind of the plan. Post-market surveillance means after the product is out in the market, the company has to keep track of what's happening, basically. FDA in the medical device marketplace, let's just quickly go through this. You're going to be hearing about this from other speakers. I'm just going to run through it. Clearance to market. This is the open market where reps can come into your office and tell you this is the greatest product that ever was and it's better than everything else out there. And this is the application process. Okay, certain products are exempt from the process. If they were in the market before 1976, they're kind of grandfathered in. Now with the new law, the government's allowed to look back at some of those products if they're dangerous. Class 1 markets, testing systems, surgeon's gloves, facial lubricants, goniometers, which you use to measure joint range of motion and so forth. Class 2, jet lavage, wheel stretchers, and also a lot of our orthopedic implants like plates, screws, things like that are Class 2 exempt products, meaning they can just be marketed. Basically, when a new product comes along, these products can just be marketed. They're cleared to market kind of automatically if they're like that. However, a company or importer that wants to put a new product on the market sends an application claiming the device, may send an application claiming the new device is similar to products already on the market. This is called a 510K notification. The way in which it works is the government has 90 days to respond, or they'll just go ahead and market the device if the government doesn't say anything. But most companies, under most circumstances, want to hear from the government that yes, this is a 510K device, meaning that it's similar to products already on the market. Just a little bit of a change, but it's okay. In other words, the plate now is titanium instead of stainless steel, or it has bigger holes or smaller holes or compression holes, something like that. That's how the system works. If the company decides to go ahead without receiving a response from the federal government, the feds can take the product off the market later on. So nobody really wants to go past this product. Everyone wants to get their 510K. Then, of course, once you notify them, no objection by the government, you're out here in the open market. Okay, the government can say, no, this device is not exactly the same as what's already in the market, so you're going to have to go through this process, investigational. You're going to have to investigate the device and use the IDE process, investigational device exemption. That involves a number of steps. Controlled clinical trials, prospective and randomized if possible. There's a limited number of investigators, predetermined number of subjects, adequate follow-up period, meticulous data collection, and a dedicated surveillance staff. Additionally, the Institutional Review Board has to approve the project, and there has to be extensive informed consent. If you have a completely new device, that automatically needs an IDE, something that's different than anything else on the market, okay? So that goes right to the IDE process. It has to be tested. Costs, how much you think for an orthopedic device? 50 million, 100 million? Something new? In that range? Okay. So people would like to get here and skip this. So, for example, when we brought the Lazarev system into the United States, this is what I was kind of like the clinical guy, and Smith & Nephew, which was called Richards in those days, was the company. We wanted to get this thing as a 510K. So we said, hey, this is just a circular fixator system. We didn't say anything about the fact that we're doing bone lengthening, which had never been done before. Circular fixation system, very similar to the Ace Fisher, which was already in the market. The Ace Fisher 510K'd in on the Hoffman 510K'd in on the Anderson device, if you're familiar with these external fixators. So this is called piggybacking. In other words, an incremental change from a previous incremental change from a previous incremental change, and that's basically, and it was approved. Boom. Except The FDA looked at the olive wires and said, what's this? It's a wire with a little bead on it. The bead metal was different than the wire metal. And it was welded on with a third metal. And the Fed said, "How, we don't even know anything about these. These are Russian metals. We never use these things in the human body," in spite of the fact that probably more than 1 million of them had been used in the Soviet Union and throughout the socialist countries of the world. And they said, no, we want this to go through the IDE process, the olive wire. Well, we couldn't use the system without the olive wire because they keep the bones from sliding sideways. So the people at Richards had an absolutely brilliant idea. I mean, how they came up with this, I have no idea. They decided instead to create their olive wires by taking 4-millimeter bar stock, a bar, and grinding away all of the metal except for the little bead, all the way down to a 1-millimeter wire. And to this day, the olive wires that are used in this country from that company and from every company are not actually wires. They're milled bar stock. Even though they look like wires, they work like wires, they smell like wires, and they stick into patients like wires, they're not wires. And with that, they're just wires, right? No problem. And so they got the 510K, and that's how it happened. Very clever. Brilliant. Of course, the wires cost $100 instead of $5 because they're milled. But hey. Okay. So that's the process. If you're in here, investigational device exemption, then you've got a lot of things to do. You can't just go through this process and then boom, you're in the market. No, you have to get it approved by the feds. Pre-market approval, PMA. PMA, product must be proven safe and effective. Panel of experts review the data. You'll be hearing more about expert panels, I think. Either they approve or reject the application, or they make suggestions for more data. And then finally, if you get past there, boom, you're in the market. Now, once you're in the market, you have to demonstrate, the company who's making these products, it has to demonstrate good manufacturing practices. That means labeling, manufacturing, packaging, storing, installing, servicing, training, and auditing. And the other thing you have to have is post-market surveillance. And this is something that was not done very much in the good old days, but it's certainly a part of the process now. And that includes tracking, reporting, and so forth and so on. The government decides which products require post-market surveillance. They have a whole list of them. Usually they're things where the failure would result in death. At first it was just death, now it's death and serious injury. And you can see glenoid fossil prosthesis is up here, orthopedic, and intra-articular disc prosthesis, interestingly enough, is up there. And FDA can require these things, this post-market surveillance, if the consequence is likely to lead to death or serious health consequences. Investigational device testing has a limited number of patients. There's a profit motive involved, marketing pressure, developer enthusiasm. As I mentioned earlier, developer enthusiasm has these features of a learning curve, eliminating the earliest cases, subjective outcome data, short follow-up, and patients are lost to follow-up. I'm just going to give you an example. I pulled this off of PubMed this morning, all right? Journal of Spine, 2003. Schiffman, a doctor out here in Los Angeles. The interesting thing is that this guy works for the company that makes the product. He's one of the co-authors. But at least it's out there, it's not hidden, although it doesn't exist in the PubMed abstract. Okay. This is the product we're talking about, the back cage. These were extremely popular about 4 or 5 years ago, so popular, in fact, that we tend to call it putting these things in cage rage. This is what they look like when they're in place. They're not used hardly anymore because their patients are very unhappy with the outcomes. But let's look at this paper over here, all right? 71 patients. 75% satisfactory results. That means there are 25% unsatisfactory results, right? However, and so that led the doctor to say, and this is again off the PubMed abstract, bilateral implant of low-profile cages in this patient population led to satisfactory outcomes. The interesting thing is, if you read the paper closely, 32% were lost to follow-up. Now, I happen to know this doctor's practice. He was a former patient, a resident of mine at Rancho. It's all lawyer referrals. If the patient, the only reason why the patients leave the practice is because they're unhappy with the outcome. The only reason, because the lawyers tell them you cannot leave this doctor. There's very complicated reasons in workers' compensation. Oh, by the way, these are all workers' comp patients. There's very complicated reasons why you cannot leave this doctor who I sent you to, all right? 32% lost to follow-up. People have looked at lost to follow-up patients. Wilsey, for example, a famous spine surgeon in Long Beach, wondered why his results that he was reporting are not the same as the other people were reporting for the spine fusion that he invented. And he hired a detective agency and tracked down every patient that was lost to follow-up, and they were all unsatisfactory outcomes. So if you take the 32% lost to follow-up and you add it to the 25% unsatisfactory results, you get 57% unsatisfactory results. The hidden assumption here is that the ratio of good and bad results in the loss to follow-up in the paper is the same as the ones that you actually get to do the SF-36 scores on. And in fact, when you realize that the patients leave the doctor because they're unhappy with the outcome, all of a sudden, this becomes an operation where where the patient is more likely than not to have a clinical failure. All right, this is a critical point, and unfortunately, it happens in a lot of papers. And of course, this is what other people not involved with the product were finding out, and that's why the product is not being used anymore. Marketplace experience, however, in the open market, there's an unlimited number of patients. Clinicians who are not involved in the development of the product or are not profiting from the product are skeptical. Profit motive is reduced, of course. There's longer follow-up, and the expectation pressures from the patients that now take over. Nature finds the hidden flaw. The market is the test place for this, believe it or not. I recommended in this paper that when it comes to new products, we should have this, a new product notice that says this. This product is new. It has been tested according to the FDA's procedures and determined to be safe and effective. Unforeseen problems may become apparent with the passage of time and may limit the product's value or cause unexpected complications. And that's kind of a liability waiver, you might say. But this is, we've tried to send this to several offices in the Congress, and nobody seems to buy into it. Signed by the patient and the doctor, and it actually kind of this new product status lasts for a certain predetermined period of time to be decided by the panel. And what it does is basically a liability protection for the companies. It allows them to move forward and develop products because the patients who are risk averse won't take the product. The patients who are willing to take risks will take the product. In a book by Managing the Medical Arms Race by Susan Foote, she said the social function of regulation depends on information. Gathering data before marketing and reporting problems once the problem has been distributed. The threat of liability intimidates producers. Thus, there are powerful incentives, even for responsible producers, to protect and withhold information. This happened with Vioxx. The first reports coming back, they didn't want to believe it over there at Merck. Dr. Benjamin Franklin, my hero, and Dr. Thomas Bond founded Pennsylvania Hospital together in 1750. About 25 years later, Bond's son was thinking of becoming a doctor. And so Bond wrote to Franklin, who was working in London at the time, and he said to him, "What medical school do you think my son should go to?" So Franklin, in his response, went through the medical schools, their pros and cons, Edinburgh, London, Stockholm, and Paris. And he said this instead: "I suspect there is more value in physics," which is what medicine was called in those days, to be learned from the honest, candid observations of an old practitioner who is past all desire of more business, having made his fortune, and who by experience has discovered the inefficacy of most remedies and modes of practice, than from all the formal lectures of all the universities upon earth. Benjamin Franklin, 1772. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hope that gives a background to some of the things you'll be hearing in the rest of this morning's program.